Hi there. Simple question for you. Who are you writing your essays for? Now, if you've responded to that question by saying, well, I'm writing them for my tutor or whoever it is that marks my work, then there's a very good chance you're needlessly throwing away marks for your efforts. In this video, I'll explain why and how you can avoid this happening to you. If you've ever watched a quiz show like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, then you can probably relate to a scenario whereby the contestant is stuck on a question that you are completely confident that you know the answer to. And of course the contestant will probably phone a friend and ask the audience, but those things might not help them out. In the meantime, you're probably sat at home on the couch getting increasingly frustrated at the poor contestant for not knowing the answer to a question that you think is very obvious. If you can relate to this, then what you're actually demonstrating is something that psychologists call the hindsight bias. The hindsight bias simply refers to the finding that once we know something, we tend to reflect on that knowledge as being easy or obvious because we can't or won't descend it from our own perspective and see it from the point of view of someone who is yet to learn what we have learned. A fascinating early study into the hindsight bias was provided by Fischhoff and Beyth back in 1975, and they were interested in looking at how people reflect back on predictions they'd made about the likelihood of a certain event occurring. Now what they found was that people were consistently and systematically adjusting their memory of predictions they'd made about the likelihood of an event occurring to create the impression that they knew it all along. Now at this point you might be thinking, well, that's all well and interesting, but what's it got to do with writing an essay? Well, the implications of the hindsight bias for your essay writing are twofold. Firstly, if you look back at something that you've learned as being self-evident or obvious, there's a good chance that you'll think, well, that's just too simple to include in my essay. But the problem is that you get marks for what you can demonstrate that you've learned in your writing. You don't get marks for things that don't appear on the page that the tutor has to infer that you might know. So if you're looking back at what you've learned as being simplistic or easy or self-evident and obvious, and you don't include that in your composition, but it's material that you should be demonstrating that you know to get marks, then obviously your grades are going to suffer as a result. The second implication of the hindsight bias for your essay writing is that if you look back at information you've learned as being too simplistic or obvious or self-evident, then there's a good chance that if you do include it in your essay, you're going to want to try and embellish it in some way to sound higher level than it actually is, so that it reflects well on your intelligence. But the problem is that the way that people tend to do this is to crack open the thesaurus and start using unnecessarily long and complicated terminology, or to make their work more long-winded and verbose. And all of these things have the opposite effect from making you sound more intelligent and actually make it sound like you're blagging and you don't know what you're talking about, or just make your work rather impenetrable and difficult to understand for the reader. And none of these things are going to help when it comes to the marks you get awarded for your efforts. So how do you avoid the hindsight bias having a negative effect on your essay writing? Well, it's all to do with who you think the target audience for your essays is. Now, if you think you're writing for a tutor or an expert on a topic, there's a much greater likelihood you're going to fall foul of the hindsight bias. And that's because if you think something that you've learned is obvious to you, then you're going to think it's going to be even more obvious to someone who's an expert on that topic. And that's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to omit important information from your essay or express yourself using unnecessarily complicated language or terminology to try and impress your tutor. What you want to do is imagine that you're writing for an intelligent but uninformed person. Make them the target audience for your essay. So, in other words, you can't assume knowledge on their behalf. You have to assume that they're interested in the topic, but they don't yet know anything about it, and it's your job to give them the exposition that they need.